On April 3, 1886, Patricia Vance walked the wagon road east of Cedar Hollow, Kansas Territory, with a canvas satchel slung across her shoulder and two children keeping pace behind her. Charlotte, 10 years old, carried a folded quilt that had once belonged to her father. 7-year-old Benjamin held a small tin lunch pail that no longer held any lunch. The prairie stretched flat and pale around them, brown grass bending in a wind that smelled of dust and dry cottonwood. It had not rained in almost 5 weeks. Patricia had already been turned away from 4 homesteads that season. In Junction City, a widow with young children was considered a burden before she was considered a hand. She had learned to keep her voice low and her eyes steady when she asked for work, and she had learned not to explain more than was needed. Her husband Isaac had died the previous autumn from a fever that took him in 9 days. What he left behind fit inside the satchel: a folding knife, a leather Bible with pressed grass between its pages, and a small notebook of remedies he had written down during the years they had lived beside Kiowa neighbors on the Cimarron. At the last crossroads before the open range, a wooden marker leaned toward the north. Whitfield Ranch, 2 miles. Beneath the letters, someone had painted a smaller word years ago and then tried to scrape it away. Hearing. The scrape had not been thorough. Patricia adjusted the satchel strap across her collarbone, took Benjamin's hand, and turned onto the rutted track. The ranch appeared slowly out of the flatness. A low limestone house sat against a gentle rise, its chimney thin and cold. A long barn stretched east, its double doors closed against the wind. A pole corral held 6 horses and a single mule. Patricia counted the cattle on the near pasture, 43 head, most of them lean, some already dropped for the day beneath the sparse shade of a cottonwood grove. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was no washing on the line. The whole place had the quiet of a house where no one bothered to keep time anymore. She stopped Charlotte and Benjamin at the gate. "Stand where I can see you," she said. "Do not touch the horses. Do not speak unless he speaks to you first." Charlotte nodded. Benjamin only stared at the barn. George Whitfield came out to the porch before Patricia had finished her second knock. He was somewhere near 65 years old, tall, and holding a coffee tin in one hand as though he had forgotten it was empty. His beard had gone gray without any pattern to the graying. His shirt had been buttoned in a hurry. He looked at Patricia the way a man looks at weather that has already decided its own direction. "Whatever you're selling," he said, "I don't need it." "I'm not selling anything, sir. I'm looking for work. I can cook, keep a house, mend, wash, tend a garden. I don't ask for wages, only room for me and my children through the season." George's eyes moved past her to the 2 figures standing near the gate. He looked at Charlotte's quilt. He looked at Benjamin's empty pail. Something in his face closed like a door that had been left ajar too long. "This is no place for a woman," he said, "and no place for children. Turn around before it gets dark." Patricia did not move. She kept her hands folded in front of her apron so he could see they were empty. "Sir, my husband died last October. I have walked from Junction City. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a place where my children can sleep under a roof while I work off the room and the food. 2 weeks. If I am not useful, we will go." George set the empty coffee tin down on the porch rail. His right hand trembled slightly before he steadied it against the wood. "I said no." "May I ask why?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her again at Benjamin, who had crouched down to touch a beetle crawling near the fence post. Something in the old rancher's shoulders shifted, not softening exactly, but tightening in a way that suggested an older wound had been pressed on. "Because I buried a woman on this ranch 4 years ago," he said, "and I buried the child she was carrying with her, and I have not kept a house since. There is no bed made up. There is no food that isn't dried or salted. There is dust in every corner and a stove I do not light unless I have to. This is no place for a boy that's small or a girl that thin. Go back to town. Ask the preacher for the church cellar. Tell him George Whitfield sent you if it helps." He turned to go inside. He was not cruel about it. He simply turned the way a man turns when he has said what he came to say. Patricia felt the door close behind him before it actually closed. She stood for a moment on the step, her hand resting near the frame but not on it. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitfield," she said through the wood. She meant it. He did not answer. She walked back to the gate. Charlotte was waiting with her hand on Benjamin's shoulder. The girl had heard enough to understand and had the sense not to ask. Patricia knelt down and adjusted the strap of Benjamin's pail so it would not chafe his neck. She did this slowly because it gave her hand something to do while she decided which direction to walk next. Cedar Hollow was 6 miles behind them. The sun had another 3 hours in the sky. The preacher, George had said, the church cellar. It was not a promise, but it was a name, and a name spoken out loud was more than she had walked in with. "We are going back to the town," she told Charlotte. "There is a church. It may be empty. We will sleep there tonight, and I will think in the morning." "Was the man angry?" Benjamin asked. "No, sweetheart, he was sad. Sad and angry are not the same. Sad makes a man send you away. Angry makes him say something worse. Do you understand the difference?" Benjamin thought about it. Then he nodded, though Patricia could tell he was only agreeing so she would not worry. She kissed the top of his head and stood up. The wind pushed her skirt sideways as she started back down the rutted track. Behind her, the limestone house held its silence. She did not look back. She had learned over the winter that looking back at closed doors only made a person slower on the road ahead. The church at the edge of Cedar Hollow had not held a Sunday service in almost 2 years. The circuit preacher who had once ridden through every third week had died of pneumonia the winter before last, and no replacement had come. The building was a single-room clapboard structure with a short steeple, a bell that no longer hung true, and 4 windows, 2 of which had been boarded over after a hailstorm. The door was not locked. It had never been locked. A rancher named Elias Cobb kept a rough eye on it and swept the porch when he remembered. Patricia opened the door slowly. The hinges made a sound like a throat clearing after a long silence. Inside, dust hung in the slanting late afternoon light. 6 pews remained, 3 on each side of a center aisle. A small wood stove stood near the pulpit with a length of black pipe rising crookedly through the roof. Behind the pulpit, a narrow door led to a room that had once been used for storing hymnals and the preacher's traveling case. That door was closed. Patricia crossed to it and opened it. The small room held a cot frame with no mattress, a chair, a shelf with 3 empty tin cans, and a broom leaning against the wall. There was a stovepipe hole in the ceiling that had been patched with tin. The floor was dusty but sound. "This is where we will sleep tonight," she told the children. "Benjamin, help your sister sweep. Charlotte, take the quilt and shake it outside. I will look for water." She found a pump behind the church that still worked after 12 pulls. The water came up rust-colored and then cleared. She filled a tin can and set it aside to settle. Behind the pump, half hidden in tall, dry grass, she found a small vegetable patch that had gone completely wild. Onions had come up on their own. 2 small potato plants had survived. A row of turnip tops showed green where the deer had not yet found them. She stood over the patch for a long time. Then she went back inside. By dusk she had swept the small room, laid the quilt over the cot frame with her canvas satchel folded as a pillow at one end, and boiled 2 of the small potatoes in the tin can on the wood stove. The stove drew poorly. Smoke pushed sideways into the room until she opened the front door of the church to give the air somewhere to go. Benjamin ate his potato without complaint. Charlotte gave half of hers to her brother when Patricia was not looking. Patricia noticed and did not correct her. There would be time for that lesson later when they were not so hungry. That first night, Patricia sat awake for a long time in the pew nearest the stove. She listened to the wind coming out of the southwest. It was a dry wind, and it carried the smell of grass that had cured too fast in the sun. Isaac had once told her, sitting beside a Kiowa man named Standing Elk on the Cimarron, that a prairie in a spring like this one was a prairie holding its breath. Any spark that fell into it would not stay small. She had written that down in the notebook, along with the trick Standing Elk had shown him for wetting burlap in a creek and dragging it behind horses to break a low fire before it climbed into the taller grass. She did not know then how soon she would need those pages. She only knew the wind smelled wrong. She closed her eyes and slept sitting up, one hand on Benjamin's ankle through the open doorway. Morning brought a hard blue sky and no dew. Patricia was up before the children. She pumped a fresh can of water, washed her face and hands, and stood on the church porch looking east toward the open range. The wind had not changed direction. It had only grown steadier. She went back inside and woke Charlotte first. "There is a garden behind the church that has come up on its own. I need you to help me learn what is still growing. Benjamin, you will carry water, 1 can at a time. Do not fill it past the second rivet or it will be too heavy." They worked through the morning in the wild patch. Patricia pulled weeds from around the onions and set aside 4 small ones for the evening meal. She lifted 2 potato plants gently, took what was ready, and pressed the soil back around the roots that were still growing. She showed Charlotte how to tell a young turnip from a weed by the shape of the leaf. Benjamin carried water until his arms were tired, and then he carried it a little longer without being asked. At mid-morning, a wagon came slowly up the road. It was Elias Cobb, the rancher who kept an eye on the church. He was a short, thick man in his 50s with a badly healed collarbone that made his left shoulder ride higher than his right. He pulled his mule up at the fence and studied Patricia without dismounting. "You staying in the church?" "Yes, sir. Just my 2 children and me. We came in yesterday. Mr. Whitfield told me the preacher's cellar might be empty." "Whitfield sent you here." "He did not send me kindly, but he named the place. My name is Patricia Vance." "My husband was Isaac Vance. He died last October in Junction City." Elias chewed the inside of his cheek. "The building's not mine. It's not anybody's, really. Preacher Holly's died and nobody wrote a will for a church. You can sleep there. Nobody in town will trouble you for it. Might be a woman or 2 will bring a loaf if they know. I'll mention it at the store." "Thank you." He looked at the vegetable patch. "You brought that back up already?" "It came up on its own. I only cleared around it." He nodded once slowly. "Wind's wrong this week. I noticed." He looked at her a beat longer as though he were revising an opinion he had formed before he arrived. Then he clucked at the mule and moved on toward town. By that afternoon, 2 women had come by the church. One brought half a loaf of bread wrapped in a flour sack. The other, a Mrs. Doreen Halstead, brought a jar of pickled beets and a folded piece of oilcloth she said Patricia could use to patch the boarded window from the inside if she wanted the light without the draft. Neither woman stayed long. Neither asked questions Patricia was not ready to answer. Patricia thanked them both by name and remembered their faces. That evening, as she was setting the beets on the small shelf, she heard boots on the church porch. 2 men, not 1. They were speaking in the easy voices of men who did not know they were being overheard. Patricia was in the small room behind the pulpit. She stepped quietly to the doorframe and stood still. "Half these ranches, old Whitfield first. He's stubborn but he's tired. 1 good scare and he'll take 20 cents on the dollar." The other man laughed. It was a short, comfortable laugh. Patricia did not move. Patricia held her breath and listened. The 2 men had walked into the church itself, not just the porch. Their boots made hollow sounds on the plank floor. She could hear one of them slap the back of a pew as he passed it, the way a man does when he is taking possession of a room in his mind. "You've said that about Whitfield for 2 years, Ro. I've been patient. Patience is the cheapest tool in this business." The voice belonged to the first man. It was smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned somewhere that certainty is more persuasive than volume. "Look at the grass this year. Look at the sky. I don't have to do anything but be ready when the wind does the work. A single match in the right draw, and half these old men will be looking at burned pasture and empty barns by the end of the month. Then I ride in with paper and a fair price." "Fair to who?" "Fair to the man holding the pen." The other man laughed again, quieter this time. "You're going to hell, Silas. I'll get there in a carriage." They stood a while longer. Patricia heard the scrape of a boot heel, the small metal sound of a watch chain, a match being struck and then blown out. One of them said something about supper at the hotel. The other agreed. Then the boots crossed back over the plank floor, the door creaked, and the church was silent again. Patricia did not move for a long count. She listened until she was sure the wagon on the road outside had actually gone, not just paused. Then she stepped back into the small room and sat down on the edge of the cot frame. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees until they stopped. Charlotte was watching her from the corner where she and Benjamin had been playing a quiet game with pebbles on the floor. The girl had heard the voices too. She had the sense of a child raised by careful parents, which was to say she knew when to keep her face still. "Mama, it is all right, sweetheart. 2 men came in and did not know we were here, that is all. They said something bad. They did, and I want you to remember what they said. Not tonight, tonight we sleep, but I want you to remember. Can you do that?" Charlotte nodded gravely. "The tall one had a gold chain. I saw it through the crack in the door." Patricia looked at her daughter and felt something in her chest ease and tighten at the same time. 10 years old, and already the kind of witness who noticed the chain. Isaac had been that kind of man too. He had noticed things and written them down in his small notebook so that, when he needed them again, they were still there. That night Patricia opened Isaac's notebook and turned to the last pages he had written. The remedies for burns, the pages on poultices of prickly pear pulp and cool clay, the instructions on soaking burlap in creek water and dragging it across the leading edge of a low fire, taught to him by standing elk beside the Cimarron, the names of plants that pulled heat out of skin, the measurements written in his neat, small hand. She did not know yet why she was studying these pages tonight instead of the ones on preserving turnips, but she trusted the feeling. Isaac had also taught her to trust it. She closed the notebook and slept sitting up again, listening to the wind. 3 weeks passed. Patricia settled into a rhythm inside the church that did not quite feel like living but was steadier than surviving. The garden gave her onions and turnips and a small crop of early peas that Charlotte had found along the back fence. Mrs. Halstead came by twice more with bread and once with a small crock of lard. Elias Cobb dropped off a bundle of split kindling without saying anything about it. Benjamin gained back a little of the weight he had lost on the road, and Charlotte's cough, which had followed her all winter, faded into the dry spring air. Patricia asked in town quietly who Silas Rowe was. She did not use his name. She described him. "A tall man, well-dressed, gold watch chain, comes through the country buying up ranches." Mrs. Halstead had said, "Oh, that would be Mr. Rowe. Land speculator out of Topeka. Been in and out of the county for a year, maybe longer. Some folks like him. My husband does not." Patricia thanked her and did not ask another question. She wrote down what Charlotte had seen: the gold chain, the height, the voice, the name of the other man, whom Silas had called by no name at all but who had laughed twice and mentioned supper at the hotel. She noted the date and the time of day. She put the paper inside Isaac's notebook between the pages on burlap and fire. On the 22nd of April, the wind changed. It swung around before dawn and came out of the south-southwest, hot and dry, carrying a smell that was not quite smoke and not quite dust. Patricia was up before the light. She stood on the church porch and watched the horizon. The eastern sky was the color of old brass. There was no cloud. There was only the wind, and the wind was wrong. By 9 in the morning she could see the smoke. It was still low, a smear along the southern horizon, the kind of line that could be a grass fire 20 miles off or a grass fire 5 miles off, and no one on the ground could tell which. By 10, the line was thicker. By 11, she could smell it inside the church with the door closed. She did not wait for anyone to tell her what was happening. She woke the children and gave them each a task. Benjamin was to fill every container in the church with water from the pump. The tin cans, the crock Mrs. Halstead had brought the lard in, the bucket, the boiler pan. Charlotte was to take every burlap sack Patricia had gathered from behind the church over the past 3 weeks, 6 of them, folded in the corner of the small room, and lay them flat on the porch. Patricia herself went to the shed behind the church, where an old hand wagon with a broken tongue had been sitting for 2 years. She fixed the tongue with a length of fence wire and a piece of oak she cut from a pew back with Isaac's folding knife. She did not think about the pew. Preacher Holly's was dead. The pew was wood. By noon the wagon rolled. Patricia loaded the 6 burlap sacks and every container of water they had filled. She soaked the sacks until they were heavy and dark. Water ran out the bottom of the wagon bed and left a trail on the dry ground. She looked south. The smoke line had climbed into the sky. She looked north, toward the Whitfield place. "Charlotte, Benjamin, coats on. We are going to the ranch." The 4 miles between the church and the Whitfield gate were not the 4 miles Patricia had walked 3 weeks earlier. The grass along the road had gone from brown to something paler and drier, and the wind pressed against her back with a steadiness that felt almost like a hand. Charlotte pulled one side of the wagon tongue. Patricia pulled the other. Benjamin walked between them with a soaked burlap sack folded across his shoulders because Patricia wanted him damp if a spark carried that far. He did not complain about the weight of the wet cloth. He had understood without being told that this was not a day for complaining. They saw the fire before they reached the ranch. It was still south of the road, moving on a diagonal line pushed by the southwest wind, low in the grass, running the way a prairie fire runs when it has not yet found anything tall to climb into. Smoke rolled ahead of it in long gray banners. Patricia could hear it now, a soft, continuous crackle, not loud yet, but the kind of sound that filled in behind you and did not stop. The Whitfield gate stood open. That was the first wrong thing. The second was the barn. The roof was already gone on the south side, black smoke pouring out of the open rafters, flames licking along the eaves. The hay inside had gone up fast. Two of George's hired men were running across the yard toward the corral, where the horses were screaming and turning tight circles. A third man was already on a horse and riding north, away from the ranch, away from the fire, and away from George. Patricia watched him go and did not waste breath calling after him. George Whitfield stood in front of the burning barn with a wet feed sack in his hands, beating at a line of flame that had begun to run along the base of the fence. His hands were black. His sleeves were black. When he raised the sack to swing again, Patricia saw that the skin on the back of his right hand had already blistered. He did not seem to feel it. He was 70 years old and he was fighting a fire with a wet sack because there was no one left to fight it with him. Patricia did not call to him. She turned the wagon east along the fence line between the fire and the cattle pasture where the remaining herd had bunched against the far corner. She counted as she moved, perhaps 30 head still standing. The rest of the pasture was empty and she did not let herself think yet about where the missing cattle had gone. "Charlotte, listen to me. You take Benjamin to the stock pond behind the house. You stay in the water up to your knees. You do not come out until I come for you. If the fire jumps the fence and you cannot see me, you get down in the water and you put a wet sack over both your heads and you stay there. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama." "Do not argue. Do not look for me. Go." Charlotte took Benjamin's hand and ran. Patricia watched them clear the corner of the house before she turned back to the wagon. Then she pulled 2 soaked sacks off the bed, tied one across her mouth and nose, and dragged the other behind her along the base of the fence, laying a wet line in the dry grass exactly where Standing Elk had shown Isaac to lay one, exactly where Isaac had written it down. She worked toward the leading edge of the fire. She did not look at George. She had 4 sacks left and she meant to use them. The trick, Isaac had written in his small, careful hand, was not to fight the fire where it was tallest. The trick was to lay a wet line ahead of it in the grass, along a length the fire had to cross, and to keep that line wet long enough for the low flames to reach it and starve. A prairie fire in short grass does not jump far unless the wind gives it a ladder. Patricia had no time to plow a fire break and no team to pull a plow if she had. She had 6 soaked sacks, 3 of them still in the wagon, a wind at her back, and a stretch of pasture fence that ran east-west across the leading edge of the fire. She dragged the first sack the length of the fence toward the corner where the cattle had bunched. The wet cloth left a dark strip on the pale grass. She dropped it, ran back for the second, and dragged that one in an overlapping line, pressing it down with her boot at the seams so no dry gap showed. Then the third. The fourth she used to soak the base of the fence posts themselves, because dry cedar would carry flame across a fire break faster than anything else on the ground. By the time she went back for the 5th sack, the fire had reached the wet line. She stood 20 feet away and watched. The low flames ran up to the dark strip, hesitated, ran along its edge looking for a way through, and then, in one place, began to lift. She pulled the 5th sack off the wagon, ran forward, and threw it flat on the lifting flame. The heat came up through the sole of her left boot. She did not step back. She pressed the sack down with a length of fence rail she had grabbed off the wagon and held it there until the flame beneath it went out. She used the sixth sack the same way, farther east, where the fire was trying to slip around the corner post. When it was down, she stood in the middle of the blackened strip with her arms hanging and looked at the fire she had just stopped. It was still burning south of the line, but the wind was already carrying it away from the pasture, along a diagonal that would take it into the plowed strip of an abandoned field a quarter-mile east. There was nothing left for it to climb into on this side of the fence. Only then did she turn back toward the barn. George was on his knees. The feed sack was on the ground beside him. His right hand was held against his chest and his left hand was flat on the dirt bracing him up. His face was gray under the soot. He was not looking at the barn anymore. The barn was gone. Half the roof had collapsed inward and the fire inside it was doing the slow, hot work of finishing what it had started. There was nothing left in there to save. Patricia walked across the yard. Her boots left black prints on the dirt. She knelt down in front of George and did not touch him yet. "Mr. Whitfield, can you hear me?" He nodded. "Your hands are burned. I am going to take you into the house. I have a poultice my husband learned to make. It will pull the heat out. Can you stand if I help you?" He looked at her for the first time. His eyes were red and streaming from the smoke. Whatever he had been the day he sent her off his porch, he was not that man now. "You came," he said. Patricia got him to his feet slowly. She let him lean on her left shoulder because his right hand was the worse of the two, and any pressure on that side made him draw a sharp breath. They crossed the yard together at the pace of a man 20 years older than George had looked 3 weeks earlier. The wind was already dying down. Prairie fires burn fast when they run, and this one had run past the ranch and was moving away east now, chewing across the abandoned field toward a stretch of ground that had been grazed short by someone's cattle 2 summers back and had never recovered. Inside the house, Patricia sat George down at his own kitchen table and looked around once. The room was much as she had guessed from the porch. A stove that had not been cleaned in a long while. A shelf of tinned goods. A water bucket half full. A jar of lard. A crock of what turned out to be honey 3/4 gone but still good. She took what she needed without asking. There was no time for asking. She sent Charlotte, who had come back from the pond wet to the waist and holding Benjamin by the hand, to fetch a specific thing. Behind the church, along the north side, there is a low patch of prickly pear. You have seen it. I need 3 of the flat pads, the young ones, not the old dry ones. Take the folding knife. Wrap the pads in your apron. Bring them back on the wagon. You know the way. Do you know the way? Yes, Mama. Benjamin stays here. He can carry water for me. Go. Charlotte went. Patricia turned back to George. She peeled the burned sleeve away from his right forearm as gently as she could and did not let her face change when she saw the skin beneath it. She washed both hands with cool water from the bucket, then again with water she had set to boil and let cool halfway. She spread a thin layer of honey across the worst of the blistering on the back of the right hand and along 2 patches on the left. Isaac had written that honey pulled heat and kept a burn from souring while a proper poultice was being made. Standing Elk had told him so, and Standing Elk had been right about most things. This will sting for a moment and then it will not. George nodded. He did not speak. He watched her hands the way a man watches something he has decided to trust because he has no other choice left. Charlotte came back on the wagon in just under an hour. Patricia split the prickly pear pads with the folding knife, scraped the cool inner pulp into a shallow tin, mashed it with the back of a spoon, and added a small handful of clay she had dug from the bank of the stock pond on her way back from checking the fire line. She spread the poultice thick across strips of clean muslin torn from a flour sack. She bound George's hands loosely, the right one first, then the left. When she was done, his shoulders came down half an inch and she knew the heat had begun to lift. "You will sleep here at the table for a little while," she said. "I will make broth. Do you have salt beef?" "In the pantry, second shelf." "Benjamin will help me." "Charlotte, watch him. If the bandages loosen, tell me. Do not tighten them yourself." George closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that she almost missed it. "My wife's name was Margaret." "She would have liked you." Patricia did not answer. She only rested her hand on his shoulder for one moment before she went to the pantry. George mended slowly through the first week and faster through the second. Patricia stayed at the ranch. She did not ask, and George did not offer, and the arrangement made itself the way arrangements do when no one has the energy to argue about them. Charlotte and Benjamin slept in the small back room that had once held Margaret's sewing things. Patricia slept on a folded quilt by the stove. The barn was gone. 22 head of cattle were dead in the south pasture or unaccounted for. 31 still stood, and among them was a young bull George had thought he had lost. It had walked back through the ash on the third morning as if it had been out for a stroll. On the 10th day after the fire, a buggy came up the road. Patricia was on the porch shelling peas Mrs. Halstead had sent out from town. She recognized the horse before she recognized the man. Then she recognized the gold chain across the vest, and she set the bowl down carefully in her lap. Silas Rowe climbed down from the buggy with a leather folio under one arm and a smile arranged on his face. "Mr. Whitfield inside. I heard about the misfortune. Terrible business, terrible. I thought I might come out and see if there was anything to be done for a neighbor. He is inside. I will fetch him." George came out onto the porch with his hand still bandaged, though the poultice had been changed to a lighter one. Silas expressed his sympathies. He talked about the difficulty of rebuilding at George's age. He talked about the price of lumber and the shortage of hands. Then, gently, as though the idea had only just occurred to him, he mentioned a figure. It was less than a third of what the ranch had been worth in March. George looked at Patricia. Patricia stood up and set the bowl of peas on the rail. "Mr. Rowe, on the night of the 4th of April, you were in the church at Cedar Hollow with another man. You did not know my children and I were sleeping in the back room. You said, and my daughter and I will both testify to it, that a single match in the right draw would put half these ranches into your hands by the end of the month. My daughter saw your watch chain through the crack in the door. I wrote it down that night. I have the paper. I have also spoken with Mrs. Doreen Halstead and with Elias Cobb, who has since remembered seeing your buggy on the south road the morning the fire started. Mr. Cobb is prepared to say so to the sheriff in Junction City." Silas's face did not move for a long moment. Then it moved all at once, in the way a face moves when a man is deciding whether to fight or to leave. He looked at George. George looked back at him and said nothing at all, because Patricia had already said what needed saying. Silas Rowe left Cedar Hollow within the week. Whether the sheriff ever caught up with him is a matter the county records tell one way and the old men in town tell another. George kept the ranch. In June, he rode into Junction City with Patricia beside him on the buggy seat and had a lawyer draw up papers that named her his heir and Charlotte and Benjamin after her. He signed with his left hand because the right one still did not fully close. It never fully did. He said he did not mind. If this story moved you, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. There are more like it waiting.